This playlist collects and organizes the segments of a basic background briefing on poverty. I'll start off by talking about what makes anything like poverty possible. So we'll talk about how the development of the agricultural revolution led to a change in the way that Homo sapiens lived. They started to domesticate plants and animals and manage as opposed to gather their food sources. And as a result, they were able to generate through their labor more calories than they needed to survive. So this calorie surplus meant that there was more food than was necessary being produced, and hence people could devote time to other activities generating other goods, and those goods then also got surpluses. And once we have these surpluses, then there is the potential for, some might say the inevitability of, an inequality in the distribution of those surpluses. And we'll talk about how once we have these surpluses that can potentially at least have very unequal distributions, that once we see the rise of civilizations, of large groups of people who are gathered together, collectively engaging in highly specialized activities and distributing the products of those activities to each other, that there is the potential for much greater inequalities in the distribution of these surpluses. And that's when we start to see something like inequalities that we understand as poverty. Now, in political science and economics and policy terms, probably the most central notion of poverty is the notion of extreme poverty. And extreme poverty is a prolonged scarcity of basic human needs that is severe and prolonged enough to be life-threatening in nature. And so we'll look at two definitions, a quantitative and a qualitative definition. A $1.90 a day definition that allows you to sort of talk about the amount of resources that a person has and use that to define poverty. And then we'll look at a qualitative definition, which sort of translates that $1.90 a day quantitative figure into a qualitative understanding of what poverty really is and how it affects the quality of life of individuals who are in poverty. Then we'll turn our attention to the numbers of people who are estimated to fall in that category of extreme poverty. And we'll look at the distribution of people across the globe who fall into that category of extreme poverty, including within the United States. Now, extreme poverty, this life-threatening, prolonged scarcity of multiple human needs, is the scariest and most severe notion of poverty. But there are other measures of poverty where it isn't necessarily eminently life-threatening, but it will have a severe impact on both the quality and the life expectancy, the quality of life and the life expectancy of the individuals who live in that kind of poverty. And so we'll look at some less extreme measures of poverty, talk about their definitions, the numbers of people who are affected by them. And we'll turn our attention to the sort of basic human needs that we think of as being scarce in cases of poverty. So we'll talk about chronic undernourishment, revisiting it really because we talked about it in the egoism lecture. We'll talk about the scarcity of potable water. We'll talk about scarcity of healthcare or the threats from preventable diseases. And of course, there are other basic human needs. We'll just focus on these three. And then we'll turn our attention to estimates that various people and organizations have been made for how much it would cost to eradicate extreme poverty, to get rid of all extreme poverty around the world. So we're going to start this discussion of poverty going way back in time. We're going to look at this branch of evolution that is the evolution of hominini, that is hominids. And hominids are humans and proto-humans. Basically, they're all the species that are part of or constitute the evolutionary branch that diverged from monkeys, right? And so these species in the hominin evolutionary branch are going to be different from both monkeys and great apes, though there's some people who want to include chimpanzees in hominini evolution. But generally speaking, the idea is there was this branch off from what eventually became Homo sapiens and other hominid species, and what eventually became modern monkeys and apes. Now, hominini evolution goes back, depending on where you want to draw the line, to approximately 7 million years ago or 4.4 million years ago. Now, human beings have only existed, Homo sapiens, that is, have only existed for about 200,000 years. And when we go back and look at this very long time period, then we see just how recent human beings are on the scene. But when we look at this branch overall, we realize that they lived a pretty similar life for almost all of the existence of humans and proto-humans, namely a hunter-gatherer life. So their primary activity was the gathering of food, when they would either hunt for food or they would gather fruits, nuts, things like that. And basically, in this kind of existence, a hunter-gatherer existence, it will take you about 1,000 calories to generate 1,000 calories. So there really is no surplus there. And the primary activity that you engage in every single day of your existence is hunting and gathering. Now, this is how things were for hominids, all these species, really until about 12,500 years ago. At that point in time, Homo sapiens experienced a change. So, in order to understand this time period and how various researchers think about it, I'm going to talk about it using 3 different ways of categorizing this time period. So geologists tend to think of time in terms of epochs, and the current epoch is the Holocene epoch, and it started about 11,695 years ago, and it's continuing on today. Its beginning is associated with the end of the last major glacial ice age. Now, slightly before the beginning of the Holocene, about 12,500 years ago in the earlier estimates, or into the Holocene, about 1,600 years into it, about 10,000 years ago, researchers estimate that Homo sapiens began to cultivate plants and animals, and that change in how human beings got their nourishment is referred to as the agricultural revolution. And it includes both what we think of as agriculture in terms of growing plants, but also in terms of herding and raising animals, domesticating animals and domesticating plants. And as I say, this is thought to have been at the earliest around 12,500 years ago. So very, very recent. Now, this wasn't a phenomenon that happened in one place at one time. And so saying it started 12,500 years ago is a little misleading. If we look at this map that I got off of Wikipedia, it points to various places that have been recognized as sort of hotspots, places where we have evidence that early domestication of plants and or animals occurred, and then the blue arrows that go out from these green areas, they indicate how that domestication spread from the initial area outward to other areas. And so you'll see that it happened at several places around the world. All right, so here we have this area corresponding to part of what is now China, this area corresponding to what is now the Philippines, this area corresponding to what we think of as the Fertile Crescent, this area, the Midwest and the United States, Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, and the eastern side of South America. So there are a number of different places where it looks like human beings independently started to domesticate plants and or animals, and that practice then spread from these initial areas outward. So talking about the agricultural revolution as a single thing is a little misleading. And so oftentimes anthropologists and archaeologists will talk about the agricultural revolution in terms of what they call the Neolithic period or the Neolithic revolution. And this is meant to indicate a time period in which these activities started to take place up until the point at which we think of them as having been largely accomplished, and we start to see the rise of the major early civilizations as a result of the agricultural revolution. So, generally speaking, the researchers who talk about the Neolithic period or the Neolithic revolution, they'll talk about it using the Judeo-Christian calendar. And so the earliest date that you usually see for the beginning of the Neolithic period is about 10,200 BCE, and dates that are farther on in time are about 7,500 BCE. And so that period of time is the time frame, roughly speaking, that researchers believe the Neolithic period began. Now, since this is in BCE, right, the Judeo-Christian calendar time frame, then we add another 2,000 years basically to it. And so the idea there is that the Neolithic period starting at 10,200 BCE corresponds to about 12,200 years ago. Now, this period runs then to, depending on who you talk to, 4,000 BCE to 2,500 BCE. And again, that goes roughly 6,000 years ago to 4,500 years ago. And it's during this period that various cultures begin to domesticate plants and animals, that this practice starts to spread, and that slowly but surely we start to see the rise of specialized activities by individuals so that they're not all engaged in the production of food, for instance, and they start to group together into societies that get larger and larger, and goods start to get distributed to the point where we get to something that people refer to oftentimes as civilization.